Today we're going to be again looking at the second industrial revolution that happened in the United States. There were two of them. The one that we're looking at here is more commonly referred to as just the Industrial Revolution, but there was actually one that had happened earlier in our country's history, and that was in the early part of the 1800s, from about 1800 to 1850, and it was mostly in the Northeast, and it was mostly driven by water power and steam power, mostly in textiles, which is clothing. And the second industrial revolution, which is the one that we're looking at here, was in the second half of the 19th century, which would be the years 1860 thereabouts, after the Civil War, up until about 1900. And this was all over the country, and this focused on many different industries, not just textiles. Industries such as steel and oil and the railroad industry, which were powered by new inventions, new entrepreneurs such as Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, and saw many more businesses and corporations sprout up as a result. So this is the one that we're looking at here. Let's look at reasons why this industrial revolution happened in our country after the Civil War. We talked about westward expansion, and as more people moved out west and created farms and mines and more railroad lines were established, it was easier for our country to have an industrial revolution. The industrial revolution that we're talking about here actually began over in Europe with countries like Great Britain, and it spread across the ocean to our country. We had, as a country, a huge amount of natural resources under the ground, and once we expanded out west with the westward expansion, we were able to capitalize on some of these resources, such as coal, iron ore, copper, lead, timber, and oil. Along with having a variety of natural resources under the ground in our country, we had a lot of people available to work. To make the Industrial Revolution happen, you need millions of workers, and at this time in our country's history, many hundreds of thousands and even to the millions of immigrants were coming across the ocean into our country, and that provided a huge amount of labor to work in factories, on farms, and to produce these products that made the Industrial Revolution what it was. We mentioned the railroads. And without railroads, we could not have been connected East Coast to West Coast, which allowed shipment of products and also people to be able to work in different locations. Along with natural resources, workers, and transportation, we had a great deal of capital. And all capital is really the money that's necessary, the finances that's necessary to make something happen. There happened to be a lot of wealthy Americans and Europeans at this time that wanted to see new industries in our country grow and prosper, and therefore they forked over the money to make this start up. With all of these factors combined, we also had a great deal of technology invented during this time period. You can see how many people applied for patents because of new inventions that they created. And a patent is just a protection that the government gives you when you create something that nobody else can claim it as their idea. So many people were using the combination of natural resources, greater transportation possibilities, money that was invested into some of these industries to make new technology to make our life easier. Along with that, our government was friendly towards business at this time period. There wasn't a whole lot of regulation where the government stepped in and forced businesses to comply by certain laws and set certain prices or limit working hours. But at this time, the government was pretty much hands-off, and they allowed businesses to make their own decision. And it was more about people's private property being protected, businesses being able to control their own prices, control their workers, how they saw fit. And it was good for the companies because they were able to make a lot of money. A little bit negative for the workers, though, because they usually got mistreated and exploited because of the company owners. Finally, it took talented entrepreneurs, which are just people that take a risk in order to try to make something happen. We had these individuals like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, who took business to the next level and expanded it and made business what it is today. So without all of these factors working together simultaneously, we could not have had the Industrial Revolution that we did in our country's history after the Civil War and into the early 1900s. Going back to natural resources, let's look at how some of those contributed to the growth of huge industries, like the steel industry. If you look on pages 231 and 232 of your blue textbook, you can see how the Bessemer process is what made this industry grow the way that it did. Before the Bessemer process, there really wasn't a process available to transform molten iron ore that you get from the surface of the earth is pretty soft and it's not durable. You have to remove certain particles that are in it in order to produce steel, which is the material that we have to make buildings and bridges and other kinds of things like railroad tracks. But there hadn't been a process that was available to take those impurities out of the iron to produce steel before this Bessemer process. But once the process was invented, it became very cheap and easy to take those ingredients out of the iron and therefore have steel in the end. Once the process was invented, people were able to use it to their advantage, and therefore steel was produced in huge numbers, and businesses were able to grow as a result. Most of this iron ore was found in the Great Lakes region. States like Pennsylvania and Michigan had great deposits of it, and so that's why that area of the country became the leading steel producers. Today we have football teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, and that is a reference to that time period where this area of the country was becoming the leading producer of steel. We don't have a lot of steel plants that are operating today because most of it's done overseas where it's cheaper, but at one point in our country's history we were the leading producer of steel. Andrew Carnegie, I've mentioned his name already. He was a poor immigrant who rose to be one of the wealthiest men in America at this time. He created a company called U.S. Steel, and basically it was the first billion-dollar company at that time in the entire world. He used the Bessemer process as a way to produce steel in huge quantities, and along with that he used intelligent business design to make his company expand and grow rapidly. He was able to outdo his competitors by some of his decisions. One of his major techniques that he used was something called vertical integration. And if you flip over in your blue book to page 242, you can see a diagram of how it works. It's basically the idea of buying out all the companies that are involved in making the end product of steel. So you would buy out the mines where the iron ore is taken from underneath the earth. You would try to buy out any type of production plants or factories where the Bessemer process makes the iron into steel, and you'd want to even buy up the railroad companies that transport the steel. So all of those things are a part of vertical integration, and it's what allowed Andrew Carnegie to make his company into a billion-dollar corporation. He also believed that people who had a lot of money, like himself, were responsible for using it in good ways. We're going to read something in class called the Gospel of Wealth, which basically is where Carnegie says that people who have money should use it for the good of society. Because of having huge amounts of steel in our country, if you flip back to page 232, you can see what that steel was used for. Railroad tracks used it on their planks to secure the wood down, and obviously things like skyscrapers were made possible. Cables on suspension bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge were made possible because of steel. So it had many different uses that made our country the modern country that it is today. And because of it, other industries popped up, like the banking industry, which grew because of this one particular industry, which was the result of the natural resource of iron ore. So natural resources were huge in making our Industrial Revolution take off. Let's look at another one. The oil industry. If you look back again on page 230 and 231, you can see that the first oil well in our country was dug by a man named Edwin Drake back in 1859. However, over time they were able to find out easier and less costly ways to get the oil from under the earth to the surface. Men like John Rockefeller were able to use this oil and make huge industries out of it, just like Carnegie did with steel. One thing that Rockefeller figured out was that if he could buy out most of the oil refineries, he could eliminate all of his competition. So his technique was something called horizontal integration, which is kind of similar to Carnegie's vertical integration. You can see a diagram of it again on page 242, but it's kind of like what we think of as a monopoly. When you buy out all of the companies that make the same thing that you do, that's horizontal integration. So his company was called Standard Oil, and it was one of the billion-dollar companies as well, just like Carnegie's U.S. Steel Company. So Rockefeller was able to get the oil industry basically under his control and made huge profits as a result. Unlike Carnegie, Rockefeller was a little bit more ruthless in the way that he made himself come out on top. He was able to force his rivals to give up in kind of ruthless ways, and a lot of people criticized him for doing that. But in the end, he did kind of set a model for other companies to follow in the future, like Microsoft. A lot of people say that Microsoft is like a monopoly of today. They do similar techniques that Rockefeller did back in the 1800s. Rockefeller was able to use technicalities in the law to his advantage in order to avoid the government coming in and forcing his company to break apart. He was able to come up with ideas of what's called a trust and what's called a holding company, which were both ways to try to get out of the government interfering with his business. These techniques are still used today in many businesses and corporations in our country. Let's look at another big part of the Industrial Revolution, which was about inventions. If you look in your textbook on 232 and 233, you can see some of the inventions and inventors that are mentioned that made our Industrial Revolution possible. Starting with the communications inventions, we talked about the telegraph back in the Civil War and how that was used by Lincoln to transmit messages across the battlefields. But the bad thing about a telegraph is you need people that are trained in Morse code to decode it. So when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, that now made possible instant global communication. His company that he started with his invention was known as the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or what we know today, AT&T. Another big invention in communications was the typewriter. You can see a picture of an early form of it on page 233, but that revolutionized book printing, newspaper printing, and it made possible the sending of documents back and forth and shortened up the time on those, because instead of having to spend time writing by hand, people could now type up documents much more easily and quickly. There were also inventions which allowed businesses to help consumers' lives become easier. Imagine going to the store today without cash registers to give you your change, or without adding up all of your purchases. Everything would have to be done by hand. So this definitely made business easier and people's lives easier. There were inventions that made the way that people ate completely revolutionized. Gustavus Swift is a man who invented a refrigerated railroad car, which allowed for the transportation of foods that used to spoil in the transport now possible. You could get beef from Texas, fresh fruits and vegetables from California out to the East Coast, and none of those would spoil now. So it totally changed the way that people ate. Plus, it led to the idea of packaged foods. We buy cereals in our grocery stores from companies like Post and Kellogg. They were the companies who came out during the Industrial Revolution as having prepackaged foods available, which were shipped by railroads. Finally, the two gentlemen that you see here are credited with a lot of the Industrial Revolution technology. Thomas Edison was the man who invented the light bulb as we know it. He also figured out how to run low voltage currents using different things like conductors. However, it was this man here, Mr. Westinghouse, who were able to take those ideas of low voltage currents and make high voltage alternating currents. And that's basically what big cities run off of today. Mass transit, such as subway systems, traffic lights, billboards that light up, all of them run on high voltage current, alternating currents. So had these gentlemen not invented what they did with electricity, our cities would not be the way that they are today. So inventions were a huge part of the Industrial Revolution. It made people's lives easier and business more practical. Finally, for this first recording about the Industrial Revolution, let's look one more time about the importance of transportation. The railroads, which had begun before the Civil War, were now stretched from coast to coast. If you look in your blue book, at page 239, you can see a map of how these railroad lines stretched out across our country and how they were added on in great numbers in the years after the Civil War. This is what allowed products and people to be shipped from coast to coast and made business more profitable. These railroads obviously sped up time to ship things, but even our time zones were created because of railroads. What we know as of Central Time, East Coast Time, Pacific Time, all of that came because of the scheduling of trains. Without there being certain time zones, it was impossible to know when trains were coming in, when they were departing. And so our government actually created 4 standard time zones because of railroads. So that shows you what kind of an impact they had on our daily lives. Because of railroads, cities propped up across the country, and they were able to ship products that were never before carried, like cattle from Texas, fruit from Florida. All of those things led to the creation of modern corporations and businesses. Plus, they provided thousands of jobs for workers. We talked about before how, and then you saw in the video, how many immigrants came to our country to work on the railroads, such as the Chinese and the Irish. This infected a lot of other issues with immigrants and led to laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act. But definitely they provided a lot of jobs in the time being while these railroads were being constructed. So without transportation, inventions, natural resources, and men like Carnegie and Rockefeller who were able to develop their businesses, our Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened the way that it did. So in our next recording, we'll be looking at how business strategies allowed companies to grow and also how it created labor unions because of the treatment of workers.